Hello, everyone. This is the 82nd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley in England and the 1888 Letter blog. For this episode, we interview Dr. Peter J. Watson, a lecturer in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. We will discuss the origins of Colombian football from the beginning until 1945. This will be a first in a series of interviews with Dr. Watson regarding Colombian football history. Dr. Watson is the author of Football and Nation Building in Colombia, the only thing that unites us. Well, welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thanks very much, Anne. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Could you just introduce yourself and tell us about your early football memories and history with the game?
Yeah, so I'm Pete Watson. The doctor still feels like an unnecessary addition, but I kind of, my earliest memories of football, I guess, are probably the same as everyone else, kicking it around, a little ball around in a schoolyard, one of those little plastic balls with holes in at the time. I remember my first game was going to watch Southampton versus Leicester. I'm a Southampton fan, somewhat dormant, living as I am in the north of England now. But that was my first kind of team. And I suppose that since then we traveled a great deal. We lived in Dubai, we lived in Colombia, we lived in Portugal, lived in Holland for a while. And football was often a way in to get to know schoolmates or classmates or feel like you were part of, the new communities. So that was one of the things that I guess always helped me fit in. I guess those are the early memories. I played a bit. I was kind of centre back for a while. I played goalkeeper for Southampton University as well. And then after I started teaching, then I became a bit of a coach here and there. Although I've really coached a lot more cricket and rugby actually since then.
Okay, thanks. It appears that Argentina, Uruguay, and later Brazil were the pioneers of football on the continent. What is the reference point for the origin of the game in Colombia?
So this was much debated for a long time. Colombia certainly has a reputation anyway of being somewhat behind a lot of those southern cone countries that you mentioned, mostly because Colombia wasn't really as attached to I suppose the British Empire at that point, or at least British mercantile interests. Colombia was a little bit more of a kind of backwater on the continent. For a long time, as I was saying, Colombian football's origins were hotly disputed. A lot of people said that Barranquilla was the place where football really began. But actually, a fairly recent article by Enrique Santos Molano, originally, that's been increasingly followed up, found that actually the first time football seems to have been played in Colombia was actually in Bogota. And what makes it very interesting and very different from many other parts of the continent is that it wasn't a Brit who brought it. It was actually an American, a colonel called Henry Rowan Lemley, who was a previous member of the US Military Academy. He'd fought in the Great Sioux War and actually was one of the officers who was present at the death of the Crazy Horse, death of the Sioux leader Crazy Horse, and actually was one of the people who gave anonymous testimony about the course of events that led to that. After he left the US military, he actually went to the National Military School, the Escuela Militar in Bogota in the 1880s. And after a time back in the US, he returned. And it seems that in 1892, shortly after some rules were published in El Telegrama, a Bogota newspaper at the time, there was a match between two teams of the Escuela Militar played in the kind of yard of this particular military academy, something that had been a San Agustin convent previously. And that is seen as being the first match that was officially played in Colombia. Apparently, the then president, Miguel Antonio Cano, was present and amongst a rather sparse crowd. But then it's difficult to know whether football had been played prior to 1892. You suspect it probably had, although maybe not officially in a match anyway. You imagine that maybe in the months before that game, it obviously being practiced as a as a technique for physical education and fitness for the recruits of that academy that Henry Rowan Lemley was apparently leading. So that's when it apparently started. You then have a period of disruption where football really becomes forgotten. Colombia at that time was quite a unstable place politically. There had been a series of civil wars between conservative and liberal politicians and their supporters. And then in 1892, there is a war called the War of 1,000 Days, which affects a lot of the nation. And it seems that football really gets forgotten about at that particular time. At the end of the war, 1902, we see in Bogota a taking up of the game again. There are various clubs formed, mostly around Colombian elite clubs such as the Polo Club, such as the Bartolino School, and so on and so forth. And football really takes root again at that particular time. So it seems to be in Bogota that the initial matches were played.
You mentioned at the outset that the idea of multiple births, that there are others who claim to have been the initiators of the game in Colombia. Can you discuss some of those alternate claims?
Yeah, so this is very different from what happens in certainly Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil, where a lot of the football originates in the capital city and then diffuses outwards. That really becomes the center point of football. Colombia is very different, and it's mostly because Colombia is a rather regionalized, disunited country in many ways. It's not particularly connected through transport links and communication links at the time. So you have various cities in different parts of Colombia that have considerable influence over their particular region, and although Bogota is the capital city, they're slightly disconnected. So for a long time, Barranquilla was seen as being the place where football was born. This was really because it was the main Caribbean port at the time. It was a major entrance point for trade, for migrants and ideas, and also a place of export of Colombian produce as Colombia's economy starts to grow. So you have this kind of the British sailor narrative, which again is one of the myths that no one can really pin down specifically to when maybe the first British sailors brought and played football somewhere on the beaches. What seems to have happened, or at least the story goes, is that the Colombia Railway Company was building railways between Puerto Colombia and Barranquilla along the Caribbean coast. And according to Guillermo Ruiz, a historian of football in Colombia, on the 6th of August, 1904, a match was played between a team who were wearing red and white striped shirts and blue shorts, which is now actually the kit of the Barranquilla Club Junior. And there's probably some kind of link there between Junior, harking back to these old stories of football first originating there. And then a team with white shorts and white shirts and red shorts. And apparently the story goes that these colours were chosen according to the British flag, was trying to emulate the British being played in some way. So that's the original story in Barranquilla, and then it seems to take off a few years later. One of the common stories of Colombian football and how it was birthed in different cities is that in the 1,000 Days War, a lot of elite families had sent their sons to study in Europe to get them away from the conflict. And when these students returned to the different cities, they brought football back with them. In Barranquilla, this was the case of a chap called Arturo de Castro. He brought apparently some kit and balls back with him in 1908, and then he set up a team called Barranquilla FC, and they played their first game in March of that year, 1908. What's interesting about that as well is that every player in that particular match has a Colombian name. Unlike Argentina and Uruguay, still at that time, you still have a lot of presence of British families with British sounding names. You know, the Brown family being very famous in the Argentinian case. That's not the case in Colombia. There really isn't, there are no Smiths or Johnsons or Browns or whatever else it might be. There are similar stories across the land, really. Santa Marta, which is another city along the Caribbean coast, again has a similar story of football being brought by English sailors. And the United Fruit Company, which becomes notorious in Latin America for the way they exploit local agriculture. Apparently, the story there goes in Santa Marta that sailors from the El Tortuguero boat played in a match against local workers, which they won convincingly. But that was a match apparently played in October 1909. But the story goes that football had been played prior to that. That was the first official game, apparently. I really like the story of Pasto, which is a town on the Pacific coast of Colombia, so on the other side. So the Pacific coast opens up after the Panama Canal is built, and a lot of more traders are starting to get to northern Colombia. A lot of the boats had gone up around the other side and up, but they hadn't really ever got as far as Colombia. A lot of them had stopped at Lima, for example. So there is a bit of a kind of backwater. But a chap called Leslie O. Spain apparently was sent from England by his father to find where Panama hats were made. And he eventually set up a factory near Pasto, not in Panama at all. Apparently they came from near the Ecuadorian border, which is where Pasto is. And Leslie O. Spain brought a football and a pump with him, and they had trainings apparently for the football workers on Sunday mornings before mass from 6 to 8:30 in the morning. And eventually they started playing matches in the central square in Pasto, with the problem that there was a water fountain in the middle of the square that had to be kind of, avoided with any sliding tackles or through balls. So there are lots of these types of stories. There's another story in Cali in 1898. Apparently, this seems to be the second start of Colombian football, apparently. This is a recent article by Jaime Londoño and Sonia Jaimes, who say that apparently a French priest called Pierre-Joseph Arnaud Motte had brought football to the Santa Librada College. And again, that fell away after the 1,000 Days War, and then got taken up again, including with a lot of Cali families who students returned from England and began to play it. So these places are all very disconnected. They're not easy to access at the time. There are no rail links. It takes days and days to get from the Caribbean coast to Bogota, from the Pacific coast to inland Colombia as well. So all these little bits of football developing in slightly different ways, but often around elite families, often around some kind of trade or schools and religious orders. So there's lots of different births in that kind of way.
Now, apart from these major cities, how was the game spread in other smaller cities?
Yeah, this is one of the areas that I think still requires a lot more study. I think that there's a lot of historians that are doing some really great work on this. Certainly Jaime Londoño and Sonia Jaimes are doing a lot of work on Cali. There is a guy called Miguel Cuadros who is looking at things in Bucaramanga. But generally, the kind of stories are pretty much the same. There is a 1,000 Days War. Elite families go to Europe to study, and then when the war ends, there is a time of consolidated Conservative Party rule. You have these elite social clubs that began to establish themselves, and they're increasingly aware of, I suppose, the influences of modern European and North American civilization, as increasing trade, as increasing migrants, as these sons return to Europe and find out what's going on. So there is a process of setting up sporting clubs that complement these elite cultural, what are called tertulias, these kind of meetings, I suppose, where the elite intellectuals of the time could meet and discuss opera and literature and poetry and painting and so on. Increasingly, leisure practice becomes part of these types of practices as well. So that's one way in, and again, as these various elites in the different cities like Medellin, of Cali, of Bucaramanga, of Cucuta, arrive back, these practices start becoming more and more popular. You also have, I suppose, Colombia having an economic coffee boom and gradual industrialization. It's considerably behind lots of other countries on the continent, particularly the Southern Cone, particularly behind Chile, Peru, and so on and so forth. So there is a little bit more money and a little bit more ability to invest in these types of cultural and leisure practices. So you do see, I suppose, this money becoming invested in education. There are certainly schools like the Colegio San Bartolomé in Bogota, the Librada School in Cali. There is also a school called the team that emerges from a school called Claveriano in Bucaramanga. Again, founded by someone who apparently was a colleague of Arturo de Castro in Barranquilla. These schools start growing up, they start playing football, they start playing certain other sports as well. And increasingly, as the awareness goes, they become more social events. The elites of the cities who are linked to politicians of the kind of regional governments, the municipalities, the mayors, start kind of providing more and more, I suppose, leisure spaces, building kind of quite elementary football areas where these sports can be practiced. So this seems to be fairly concurrent practices across the country. Medellin has a slightly interesting story that apparently two Belgians called Juan Heiniger and Jorge Herzig, although I think they're Spanish-fied names, certainly the first two names, created a pitch. They were merchants and created a pitch in Medellin, where a club called Sporting were founded. So there are interesting stories. I think that there is historiography and archives to be searched for in the newspapers still to find out about maybe some of the specific cases in some of the smaller cities, and particularly those more provincial towns, just to find out just how far football really did spread and how. So I think there's some still stories to be told there.
You touched on some of these aspects, but could you just expand on how Colombia's geography and some of the socio-political events taking place at the time influenced the manner in which the game was spread across the country?
Sure. Yeah, I think most of it comes down to Colombia's geography. Colombia has a lot of geography. It's got the Andes Mountains that really run pretty much through the heart of the country. You have the jungle areas, forested areas. You have these kind of slightly more plains, deserty areas in the north. You have marshlands. A lot of the terrain is quite difficult to traverse well into the early 20th century and slightly beyond. I mean, the Colombian state still has problems in accessing some of the more peripheral Pacific jungle areas, which is why a lot of these kind of guerrilla groups and drug cartels proliferate in these areas, because the state can't get there. The roads aren't very good. You have to fly, and then you might have to take a boat. So you can imagine back in the early 20th century, this is even worse. It takes weeks really for people to be able to travel from the Caribbean into Bogota or to Medellin. So really, the cities that do develop are quite isolated from each other. There aren't organized transport. Communications is really yet to develop. So they kind of live in their own little, excuse me, they live in their own little regional quarters. The economy, again, has largely been undeveloped compared to the likes of Argentina, Mexico, and Peru, which have thriving trades in different metals and meat and hides and so on and so forth. Colombia really doesn't get on this economic train until the coffee starts to become a popular product in Europe and North America. And that's where you see communication starting to improve. Eventually, we'll get the first airplanes that makes things a little bit easier in certain ways. But again, still only the elites can afford this. I think the other aspect that's important to bear in mind is that, again, Colombia has been a country of regular civil wars. The conservative and liberal traditions have led to various different uprisings at different times. The Thousand Days War is the most famous of these at the start of this century. But then, in the period that we'll go on to talk about in another episode, you also have La Violencia, which also stymies a lot of this political unity. So there are various reasons, but a lot of them come down to problems of geography, problems of a lack of economic development, and I suppose a late industrialization compared to various other cities on the continent.
To expand more on that, earlier you mentioned that in the 19th century, Colombia was considered a backwater. So how did the origins of the game in Colombia differ from those of Argentina and Uruguay, bearing that in mind?
Yeah, I think that you look at the Atlantic coast of South America, particularly Brazil, particularly the River Plate area, and round really to Chile and Lima. All these cities experienced a great deal more British economic penetration. A lot of scholars, amongst them Matthew Brown, who's actually got a book coming out about sport history in Latin America, which promises to be very good, talk about the British informal empire After after the independence from Spain of many Latin American nations in the 1810s and 1820s, British merchants and the British government at the time were the first to really recognize the opportunities of these new markets. So there are a lot more kind of established contacts between British merchants in Buenos Aires, in Montevideo, in Lima, in Valparaiso, and Santiago than ever was in Colombia. Colombia really wasn't visited. So I suppose that the British informal empire spread in these kind of cities, and eventually the community was that substantial in certain areas that the elites begin to have their own schools, and then sport, particularly cricket, particularly football, eventually start to get practiced in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, really in the 1860s, 1870s and onwards. If we kind of fast forward, a little bit, 20, 30 years, you have the first English football clubs visiting Argentina and Uruguay. Southampton, my team, I'm always proud to remember it. The real precursors of football in Latin America. Responsible for everything that followed on. It's all down Southampton. So Southampton toured there. They played 6 or 7 games in those two countries. They were followed by various other teams. I think Everton and Swindon, Exeter, Nottingham Forest. I think all went to play in South America. But they didn't go to Colombia. So Colombia isn't visited by any team until I think the 1950s from England. I think Charlton actually go in, I think 1953, somewhere around there. I'll have to check the date. So there is nothing to emulate. There is really a very small British community that doesn't establish itself particularly well. It doesn't have a huge influence. There is no real British, I suppose, tradition of educational schools developing either. So the things that are present that help ferment the game in the Southern Cone are very absent in Colombia.
So from these origins, how did football begin to gain importance in Colombia in the early 20th century, and how did this follow with the establishment of new clubs?
Yeah, so I think there's various routes, and it's very slow. It's a very slow development over the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. I think that one particular historian has written a book called We Drew 6-0 that talks about one of the first Colombian national disasters, but at least it wasn't 10 or 12-0. Talks about the first decades being firstly a chance for the elites to meet each other, and then classes to meet each other through sport, and then through different cities to meet each other, and then in the kind of 1930s, then the chance for Colombia to meet other countries. So that's how it's kind of seen. There's almost like a decade by decade, very slow progression. In the kind of the first, in the 1910s, what you see is an increasing formalization of sport in education and in certain elite institutions, and I suppose a certain amount of patronage from important elite players, for example, elite politicians, for example. The best example of this is in Bogota. Again, there are a couple of clubs that are based on elites. You still have the military school, you have the Colegio San Bartolomé, you have the Polo Club, and you also have a club called Football Club Bogota. And in 1911, they're invited to compete in a trophy that has been awarded by the president of Colombia, Carlos Restrepo. And this is played on the 11th of October. So, what is that? Something like 111 years ago, 4 days ago, as we record this. And again, this is the day in which Columbus discovered America. So it's a very important ceremonial day. And football is part of these national celebrations. So presidential approval obviously transfers to the elites wanting to be interested. A lot of the elites of society in Bogota turn up to watch the games. They become reported in the press, and they become important social and entertainment occasions, and leisure becomes slightly more formalized. And then the tournament gets repeated for the next 2 or 3 years before Restrepo's term in office ends. 14 clubs will participate in the next Copa Restrepo in 1913. And again, you can see that there are clubs that are increasingly linked to different communities in society. You have the Club Inglés, with the English club. You have a Club Colombia. You have the Santander Football Club, a club named after one of the great liberators of Colombia 100 years previously. You have the Club Liberty, and so on and so forth, the Club República. So a lot of these clubs are looking back to ceremonial, important national occasions to find their identity. The year in 1914, there are a few more. There's a club called Bolivar, named after Simon Bolivar, the great liberator. There's a club called the Albion, Club Union, El Rosario. So in 1914, there's already 20 teams that are playing just in Bogota. And again, most of them are linked to fairly elite social clubs. But increasingly, given the visibility of this, it starts to kind of very slowly diffuse downwards into the working class communities, for example. Similar things are happening in Medellin as well, in certain other cities. Cali, the club in a city in Valle de Cauca, more the south of Colombia, they're starting to play as well. Again, there are matches that are ceremonial occasions for commemorating national days, the days of independence. There are matches being played now against teams in different local towns, such as Buga and Palmira and Buenaventura. So they start to become ways in which different cities start to encounter each other. That also starts happening between Bogota and Medellin. The Bartolino club that has been very successful travel to play Sporting in Medellin, and a couple of other clubs called Medellin, which is actually the founding club of a club that still exists in the Colombian First Division now. Bartolino also play against Claveriano in Bucaramanga. So you have the start of friendly games that are supposed to create some kind of sense of national encounter or regional encounter for cities that don't often see each other, don't often travel particularly regularly between each other. This kind of carries on until 1920. There is a tournament in Bogota, which is supposedly a national championship, but very much is a Bogota-based tournament only, unfortunately. But again, you see the president, Rafael Reyes, and the visiting Prince Jaime de Borbón of Spain are there to present the trophy. So there is an increasing awareness in social quarters of how football can be important. And this is accompanied as well by increasing debates about modernization, about the health of the nation, about the need to give the lower classes, which are starting to grow within urban areas in Colombia, something to do in their free time. So there are various interesting processes going on with a kind of official recognition and an elite participation for those reasons.
So what attracted the working class to football in the post-World War I years?
Well, this is one of those areas that I think is very much under-researched. I think that there are some great researchers such as Manuel Morales and Jorge Ruiz Patiño, Rafael Jaramillo, a chap I got to meet when I was in Colombia, who are looking at and trying to look in the archives and find out how football is developing. But the working classes are fairly invisible. They seem to almost emerge through more or less, I suppose, people assuming what has happened based on other studies of football that has, I suppose, more documentation, more historical records in the rest of the continent. So I think that the stories tend to go that the coffee boom and increasing urbanization and industrialization that the coffee boom wrought meant that there is an increasing migration from rural areas to the cities. There are expanding working classes. Medellin becomes a center of textiles, for example. The Panama Canal opening means that Buenaventura becomes accessible, which is the port city for Cali, which starts growing as well. So you have the assumption, I think, or the understanding that as more working class people go to the cities, they see the football that is going on because it's in the press, it's something that's being played in certain areas. What you certainly do get, which is very clearly documented, are debates about the nation, the national race, the health of the nation, the way of which Colombia's civilization is or is not being realized 100 years after its independence. There are a lot of speeches that discuss the degeneration of the race, the fact that there is increasing vice, alcoholism, lack of fitness, Colombia is not producing men that are able to fight and work for the nation. So this is a kind of an ongoing debate that is being held in political areas, in the newspapers, in schools, and in intellectual quarters. So you start getting more of an idea of as well as having sport for leisure, which the elites are playing, you also have the idea of sport for education and developing citizens. And importantly, of moving these working classes that are increasing in the city areas away from drunkenness, away from chicken fighting and so on and so forth, away from gambling, into sports and physical activities that are seen as being more healthy, more modern, more civilized, that will develop the kind of values that will help Colombia develop as a nation and their cities develop, their citizens developing in the same way. So I think that these are some of the main ideas and some of the things that I suppose are definitely ongoing about how football starts to be played more by the masses. But I think that there's still a lot of room for really working out about which type of working class clubs are really emerging, how they're meeting some of the elite clubs. I think that that's still slightly invisible in the research that's being carried out to date. But again, there are people who are working on this, and hopefully I'll be able to work it a little bit myself the next time I manage to get out there to go and look in the libraries and other archives.
So, how did these socio-political developments in the 1920s advance the game, and how did that inform the structure of football in the country?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is that it starts becoming more of a policy of government. So once these debates have become popularized in schools, in political quarters, in conferences, the governments start to take notice. I think another really important aspect is actually the Uruguayan victory in the 1924 Football Olympic competition. When Colombia sees a country that is very small, it's a lot smaller than Colombia, it's suddenly triumphing on a global stage, they become very aware of what their own possibilities might be. And that's stimulated by a congressman called Carlos Uribe Echeverri, who actually had been the ambassador to Colombia, a Colombian ambassador in Uruguay for a previous time. And he's aware of the public health and the public leisure policies that Uruguay has carried out as being one of the most advanced in the continent. So he is the person, amongst several others, often of a liberal persuasion, who seek to bring in a public policies through government in order to engender and encourage greater sporting practice. It's important to say that sports like, I suppose, bullfighting, you have horse racing, there is some football, have been growing in popularity. They're more or less being spontaneous, organized around the elite clubs. They're very informal. Schools will have their own type of physical education practices, but these are not kind of formalized or organized in any way. So the most important law that every kind of sports historian of Colombia will point to is law number 80 of 1925, which has the main goal of officializing sporting practice, of enabling physical education as part of the curriculum in schools. They also create a National Commission of Physical Education and start budgeting for sports and physical education to be played at all levels. They also fund the hiring of teachers and coaches and sports technicians, and start a planning of more organized building of public parks and leisure spaces where sport can be practiced. So this is really where you really do see football becoming a lot more popular in working class. I suppose it consolidates the practice of football in more potential areas. And teams such as Junior of Barranquilla, which is a club that still exists. It wasn't called Junior at the time, it was called Juventud, but they originate in Barranquilla at this time. You also have the Cali club, America de Cali, one of the great Colombian clubs, is also founded around about 1927. And what's really interesting about America is that there's a photo from 1929, the first photo that I've seen of that particular club, and they have 3 or 4 black players playing there. So this is obviously a club from the Barrios Populares, from the kind of popular quarters of Cali. It's clearly not an elite club. You also, in terms of how this benefits football, because there is an attempt to create more sporting organizations to formalize the practice of sport, There are, I suppose, football associations, which again are very regionalized, which are created at the time, which try to regulate and create a more organized structure of football being played in certain cities and certain departments. The first of these is again in Barranquilla, which again for a long time has been seen as the kind of the cradle of Colombian football, even though it wasn't founded there. But they certainly do create the so-called Liga del Fútbol, the Football League, which is an association of clubs within Barranquilla. Slightly later on, there are more football leagues, football associations founded in Antioquia, the department where Medellin is, in Cundinamarca, where Bogotá is, and the Valle del Cauca, where Cali is, and certain other areas as well. So that first sports law of 1925 is what starts to formalize structures of football and to try and put in place policies that increase the practice of it on a national level. And football tends to be at the forefront of sporting practice at the time.
Can you discuss Colombia's entry at representative level football at the tail end of the 1920s and the early 1930s?
Yeah, so Colombia again, is still lagging behind the rest of the continent. As we've just said, Uruguay has won the gold medal in 1924. That was seen as being inspirational, this Olympic success. Colombia actually wouldn't have any Olympic participation until 1932, when one solitary athlete participates. But there is a growing awareness of sport as being an important aspect of modernity and a way of taking part in a global event that somehow connects the globe, somehow enables the country to be recognized in certain ways. But again, because Colombia has had very, very little sporting encounters with its own cities, let alone other countries, it has to really develop a national encounter first. And the first time this really happens is with the Juegos Olímpicos Nacionales, the National Olympic Games. So this is a tournament that is based on Olympic ideals, but very much only takes place within Colombia. 12 of the national departments agree to participate, and the games are held in Cali. Again, the departments that participate do very much not represent the whole of the national territory. Quite a lot of the country, particularly the more peripheral jungle, certainly the Pacific areas, are not represented whatsoever. And that will be a lot of the indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations are very, very invisible. So this is largely a connection of more developing urban centers. So there are various tournaments various sporting tournaments that occur in this competition. You have gymnastics, you have chess, you have athletics, and interestingly, you also have baseball and basketball, which are quite common. There is, I suppose, a slight battle between American influence, North American influence, and British influence in terms of sports being played. Certainly the Caribbean was very much a hotbed of baseball at the time. Certainly Cartagena, Barranquilla were places where a lot of baseball was played. So it's not inconceivable that Colombia could almost have become more of a power, or at least influenced by American sports, than something like football. So this is maybe a turning point in many ways. The football is really the tournament that gets the most attention from the public. It's there are various teams. I think there are 12 teams that play. The final four, interestingly, all represent different cities, which is ideal. There was a team called Técnico from Bogotá. There was Cali A from the host city, and then you have Atlántico Barranquilla from the north, and Magdalena San Marios, which is a team that's based in Santa Marta, again a Caribbean city. And I think this tournament, interestingly, one of the nice stories about this is we see the first instance of fan violence, still a common problem in Colombia nowadays, unfortunately, in the match between Técnico and Cali A. So Técnico winning 1-0, they get awarded a penalty, and the Cali fans are enraged by this, invade the pitch. The Técnico players have to flee, and then they refuse to restart the match and leave the tournament. They apparently try to come back 3 days later, but by then it's too late, so they're thrown out. So this is, I guess, one of the first official times anyway where football violence impedes football in Colombia. In actual fact, the final is between Magdalena and Barranquilla. with the Santa Marta team winning the tournament 2-0. But this is seen as being a really important moment for Colombian football and Colombian sport in general, which sees the first very highly organized, very national tournament. There is no national league still. Again, this is a long way behind various other nations that have already got these national leagues running. So it takes a kind of an Olympic national games for this to be the case in Colombia.
Football was also present in the politics and armed conflicts of the day. Can you discuss the most significant of these incidents?
Yeah, no, the best story I think is really following straight on from the 1928 National Olympic Games. One of the first massacres that have sadly become very prevalent in Colombia occurs in 1928. There is a strike in the banana plantations around Ciénaga, which again is a Caribbean city, quite a Caribbean town, quite near Santa Marta. And there is a protest against the conditions of the United Fruit Company by workers there. There is an increasing presence of, I suppose, left-wing type workers' trade unions. And there is a massacre of these workers. It's still shrouded in certain lack of detail. There is a kind of report that several hundred might have been killed. Official sources at the time put it considerably less than this. But it is, I suppose, one of those first occasions of an event of a massacre, again carried out by state forces, that kind of tarnishes Colombian history at the time. And what's interesting about it is that the Santa Marta team are returning, via boat and so on up through the country from Cali, and they get to Ciénaga and they're greeted as heroes by the local dignitaries. And the football team actually asks for some of the strikers who'd been put in jail, who'd survived the massacre, to be released as kind of a gesture of forgiveness in celebration of this achievement by the nation. And actually, this request was granted. So that's a kind of a considerably important moment where I suppose politics, trade union movements, and the power of football to, I suppose, be an intermediary or to be celebrated and to override social problems occurs. A slightly lesser known story, which I can't remember the book I came across it in, but it's a lovely story, was one of Colombia's few external wars was a border conflict called the Leticia Affair of 1932-33 against Peru, where some Peruvian soldiers invade a town of Leticia, which is in the Amazon region of Colombia, far down in the south. And soldiers are sent from Colombia to go and fight. And apparently, the story goes that Second Lieutenant Gustavo Bolaños Buccelli had been playing in Pasto. He had a team in Pasto and was then sent to fight in Leticia. And when he was stationed in a place called Gepi, which is again a very small Amazon settlement, he apparently organized football sessions when they were not fighting or on patrol. And then apparently across the border, Leticia is kind of really kind of on the very close to Brazilian territory as well as Peruvian territory. And apparently this team crossed the border to go and play a Brazilian team in a settlement in Tabatinga. Apparently he was forbidden to do so. It was not allowed by the barracks commander, but they did so anyway. Apparently won 3-0, and this, because they actually won, the barracks commander apparently forgave them when they returned, having said, we were on a hunting mission, but the story got out. But apparently the barracks commander forgave this kind of football match because at least they managed to win and got a little bit of national pride that way. So that's one of the really nice stories. Again, you don't really have this is a kind of a period of relative calm in Colombia. There are still tensions between liberal and conservative governments, but those won't really explode for another decade. So the 1930s are a time where Colombia experiences working class tensions, but there is also a political movement called the Nation in March. There's a kind of a liberal government which is trying to foment more liberal tendencies. They're thinking more of the citizens, and part of this is increasing the abilities of play and leisure and sporting activities for normal Colombians, inverted commas. So yeah, there's a couple of nice stories about how football and violence and warfare start to intermingle at a very early time.
Can you describe the first stadia built in Colombia and its differences from the rest of the continent?
Yeah, so I suppose that the difference is that because clubs are largely not particularly well organized, or rather informal, or rather small, they don't grow into these slightly more powerful social clubs that encompass the barrios. Thinking really of Buenos Aires and Montevideo, these things don't really happen. So the clubs that start, gaining more membership in the likes of Buenos Aires, Montevideo, they become clubs owned by their members. The clubs grow, the spectators grow, and they start building their own stadiums increasingly. This doesn't really happen in Colombia. There hasn't been this urge to do that. They're largely playing in rather informal areas, in schools and maybe some kind of parks that have been created under the kind of conservative governments. You start to get more of an emphasis in building stadiums from the governments following 1925, seeing the successes of Uruguay in 1924, of Uruguay and Argentina in 1928, and obviously the 1930 World Cup win by Uruguay. Colombia still hasn't played an international game at this point. So they start to see the importance of building stadiums, but they don't build them. The clubs don't build them. It's actually the local authorities that build them. The city municipalities, the government will be building these stadiums. So you have this system where the majority of clubs still to this day in Colombia do not own their stadiums. They're owned by the municipalities. The other reason for games growing is that the government of Alfonso López Pumarejo, who's a liberal, start to realize the importance of what these kind of national games could maybe do. And in 1938, there is the first hosting of the Juegos Bolivarianos, the Bolivarian Games, which is a tournament that is held between various nations that are connected by the legacy of Simon Bolivar being their liberator. So you have Peru, you have Venezuela, you have Colombia, you have Ecuador, and which is one I haven't mentioned, Bolivia. So there are 5 nations that all play, and Bogota is the host of this particular game. So they build the stadium that's called the Nemesio Camacho El Campín. That's still the home stadium of the Santa Fe and Millonarios clubs in Bogota. And this stadium is built to host the games as a demonstration of Colombian regional influence and of Colombian modernity. So that's the first time that these are the reasons why the first stadiums are built, but they're very much not built by the clubs. And again, that's still the case nowadays.
What was the situation of Colombian football at administrative level in the 1930s?
So it's largely disparate. Things have really not become centralized to a large extent. I talked a little bit recently about how in 1924 the Liga del Fútbol of Barranquilla is created and other regional associations follow suit. So Colombia is very much played and organized by regional federations. The main one is really recognized by the government as being the league or the association in Barranquilla. That eventually becomes known as ADE Football, and that is the one that will gain recognition from FIFA in, I think, 1936 or 1937. So, but Colombian football is still amateur. There's no professional football at this time, and is highly regionalized. So there's no league that is created between the different cities. The tournaments that are being played are very much either at a departmental level or a city level even. But what you are getting is the starts in the late 1920s, early 1930s, mid 1930s is the generation of the teams that now exist. Teams like, for example, Millonarios, one of the main teams in the Colombian Football League, one of the most successful teams in the El Dorado period, was certainly formed in 1937 under a different name. You have Boca Juniors of Cali, not the famous Boca Juniors, but they're founded in 1939. But you still do have a great degree of coming and going. A lot of clubs really fail to establish themselves. Deportivo Cali have kind of emerged in various different iterations from being Cali Football Club. America de Cali has more or less established itself as a a fairly regular team as well. But again, apart from occasional friendly games at certain, where they become exhibition games between certain cities, things are very much based on a regional level, and that actually is the case when Colombia actually first starts participating in international tournaments as well. The representation doesn't come from any Colombian national football association. The right to represent Colombia is fought over by various different regional associations, with actually the Barranquilla ADE football organization being the one that is the first one that sends a representative team ostensibly representing Colombia to the first South American championships that Colombia participates in.
Now, can you describe Colombia's entry into international football in 1938 into the next decade?
Yeah, so the first time is the 1938 Bolivarian Games. This was seen as a huge chance for Colombia finally to start playing some of their kind of neighboring countries. What's really interesting about this is that you see South American influence starting to take hold from other nations. The Colombian team in the 1938 Bolivarian Games is managed and coached by Fernando Paternoster. Now, he was a very important Argentinian player in the 1928 Olympic Games, where Argentina were runners-up to Uruguay. He also played in the 1930 World Cup, where Argentina again lost to Uruguay. So this is a famous person. He's made his name in Argentine football, and he's travelled north to Colombia with the idea of, I suppose, spreading the game, of developing the game, of coaching these other nations. And Paternoster is one of the first of these foreign coaches that starts to travel to Colombia. They're not particularly successful in the 1938 championship. They lose quite heavily to Peru and to Bolivia and to Ecuador as well. They managed to beat Venezuela. Nothing much has changed then. Venezuela's always been at the bottom of these championships. So it wasn't a particularly good start. The next foreign coach that arrives in Colombia to potentially participate in these foreign tournaments is a chap called Jack Greenwell. A very kind of, he needs to be known a lot more. He's a very important kind of British coach, the first one to really blaze a trail across the world. He played and managed in Catalonia for around about 24 years, was very successful for playing for and managing Barcelona. But then when the Spanish Civil War happened, he was forced to escape because he had Catalan Republican sympathies. And he actually managed he coached the Peruvian team in the 1936 Olympics, where they did very well before a very controversial game led them to abandoning the tournament. He then returned to Peru with the team, managed the Universitario club in Lima, and then he was the guy that managed Peru to the 1938 Bolivarian Games in Colombia. Greenwell actually then in 1940 travels to Colombia to coach junior in Barranquilla, and was originally going to coach the 1942 Central American and Caribbean Games team, a tournament that was actually cancelled. He moves then down to Santa Fe, which is the club in Bogota, which was founded the year before in 1941. He takes over them in 1942, coaches them in the local Cundinamarca League, but then unfortunately dies a couple of days after they'd beaten Deportivo Texas 10-3. So already you have these two international names that have created an impression, and I suppose Colombia now is starting to look outwards. They've played against clubs near them countries near them in the Central American Games and the Bolivarian Games. And in 1945, they make their debut in the South American Championships. And again, this is now the Copa America. It's worth remembering that this is the first version of that was played in 1969. So it's 29 years Colombia has been absent from this tournament. It's already taken hold. There's a lot of, like I said previously, there was a huge argument about who should represent Colombia that went up to governmental level. There were visas cancelled. There were fights between the regional associations of Antioquia, where Medellin is, of Cundinamarca, where Bogotá is, Valle Cauca, where Cali is. But eventually, because Barranquilla was recognized by FIFA, they got to to represent Colombia. So we have a team that is almost entirely based on just players from the Caribbean League, mostly from junior, which isn't the ideal way to go when you're playing kind of countries that are already very successful. There's actually there's a fantastic story about the journey to get to Chile in 1945. There's been a book written about it by a guy called Carlos Castillo Sanchez called Cuando perder era ganar un poco, when losing was winning a little bit, which I haven't managed to read yet. I'm hoping to get a copy as soon as I can. But apparently what happened was they traveled from Barranquilla to Cali on the plane. That was fine. They got to Buenaventura on the Pacific coast. That was okay as well, and found that they'd missed their steamboat. So then they have to travel via buses and lorries and various other ways, and still dressed in their kind of Caribbean clothing across the mountains into Ecuador. They then have to travel all the way down to Quito to get there. They then tried to get to Guayaquil, found there was no boat that they could get there to Valparaiso. So then they find their way into Peru by really any means possible. At this point, they're out of money, so they're actually having to play exhibition baseball games to try and earn some money to earn their passage to get to Chile to play in these games. And then finally, the then Peruvian president finds out what's going on, hears about them, and actually pays for them to travel on a cargo boat that's transporting sugar all the way down to Chile. So they arrive very late, but they're there. The problem is that they then have to play in short order. They have to play against Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and then Argentina. All clubs that are very well established. One who's already won the World Cup, one who's got to the final, all of whom are dominating the kind of continent, and several of them have travelled to Europe already. Against Brazil, they only lose 3-0, which isn't a bad start to a tournament, really. Against Uruguay, unfortunately, they fall 7-0. Apparently, quite a few of the crowd left early at the lack of competition. One of the Colombian players was sent off, but then the Uruguayan team asked for him to be let back on again because, they feel it's not going to make any difference. Against Chile, they lose 2-0. And apparently, according to the Colombian press, they show slightly more interest and slightly more enthusiasm and slightly more coordination. But then against Argentina, they get thrashed 9-1. There is their first goal in the kind of South American Cup. They scored by Arturo Guarapo Mendoza, a kind of legend, the original the goal poacher of Colombia. They then actually get a win. They then, after playing the kind of the toughest teams, they then beat Ecuador 3-1. There are goals from Luis Gonzalez, from Roberto Gamez, and Fulgencio Verdugo. Gamez and Verdugo apparently also score against Bolivia in a 3-3 draw in the final game. So they come 5th out of 7. Apparently the journey home was slightly easier, but it's not exactly a successful occasion. And unfortunately, in 1947, 2 years later, when they again go to play in the South American Championship, this time in Guayaquil, they come bottom of the table. They lose all their matches apart from drawing against Bolivia and Ecuador. And there are substantial reports of drunkenness and poor behaviour in fights from the players, to the extent that some of the press described the football teams as a national embarrassment. The only positive sign we really have from 1947 is, I suppose, the first Colombia's international football star, if we like. There is a goalkeeper from the Caribbean called Efrain El Caiman Sanchez, who performs extremely well in this particular tournament and catches the eye of some of the Argentinian players and coaches, to the extent that Sanchez is signed by one of the best teams in Argentina, San Lorenzo. So Colombia's first footballing export is officially Efrain El Caiman Sanchez after that particular team.
And how did football develop further during the 1930s and 40s in Colombia?
So really, you have a continuing process of amateur football played in these leagues. Excuse me. And it doesn't really go very far very quickly. But what you start to have is, I suppose, visiting teams from the rest of the continent, primarily the nations that are close to Colombia. I'm thinking of Panama, Costa Rica, Ecuador, that start to visit and they start to play exhibition games. You also get the first Argentinian club, Rivadavia. Again, not a big club, but an Argentinian club who visit them in 1939. They play a Cuban team. So there is a process towards, or there is a growing awareness of the power of sport as a spectator activity. And I suppose a growing awareness of what's going on in the rest of the continent. And that's also increased by things like Argentinian magazines like El Gráfico, which don't just have an Argentinian appeal, but they have a continental appeal. They start arriving in Colombia pretty much following the Second World War. That's where it really starts. And Colombia becomes aware of what's going on, of the fact that there are these leagues, that they're increasingly professional in nature. And this really does contradict the amateur ideals that are still entirely prevalent in Colombian sport. Colombian sport still is seen as a pastime of the elites. It's about civilization. It's about fair play. It's about gentlemanliness. It's not done for profit. But equally, as you start having greater interest in football, there are foreign coaches like Paternoster, like Jack Greenwell, who start to travel to Colombia, realizing the potential, who are invited there by clubs and so on, to start coaching these teams. And as that happens, there starts to be a kind of under the table amateurism that starts to develop. Certainly by the early kind of, or certainly the late 1930s and early 40s, the what becomes the Millonarios Club are starting apparently to pay a few footballers. There are a few Argentinian football players that are part of the 1937 Millonarios team, or as they're called at the time, Deportivo Municipal. They've been invited there by Paternoster to kind of play, to show the Colombians, how to play and learn the game. So there is an increasing move towards under the table professionalism going on. And there is, I guess, a growing awareness as well by entrepreneurs of football's potential. So you start to get the likes of Humberto Salcedo Fernandez, who is a businessman from originally the north. You have Alfonso Senio, these kind of influential figures who start to be questioning why we can't have a national league, why we can't have a professional league, why can't they be following the examples of these other countries that are doing well, that are starting to get international renown, that are getting big crowds, that are having healthy populations. So all these kind of debates start kind of coming together, and all it really needs is for influential figures and businessmen to start challenging the control of the game of certainly of AD Football in Barranquilla and of the other regional associations, and say, we need to start doing something more professionally for us to make a success of this, either for our own financial sake, but also for the benefit of the sporting performance of the nation. So these kind of the growing connections with the rest of the tournament, the awareness of what's going on, the increased financial strength of certain sectors of society, all lead to a push towards professionalism that really gathers pace over the 1940s.
So how was this shamateurism, as you called it, how was it addressed as a whole in Colombia, and was it prevalent in the continent, or was it just in Colombia?
I think you'd had this kind of period of shamateurism for quite a while. Was something that these were processes that were undergone in the likes of Uruguay and Argentina and other countries, a decade or so before. I can't remember, it was 1933, if I remember rightly, where the first Argentinian league was formed that was professional in nature. I think there was a split at that particular time. So these kind of arguments about, is football amateur, is sport amateur, or should it be professional, had been ongoing in the continent previously. Colombia is obviously just quite a long way behind these, and it is an important debate that's had. Again, football is controlled by AD Football and amateur associations. It's not seen as being something that should be profited from originally. And it does become a debate it becomes a very common debate in some of the newspapers as well. And it's really a conflict of ideals versus money. There are certain proponents who think that it will, just bring greed and avarice and vice and, bad habits into Colombian football, and will reduce the essential positivist nature of what football should be. So this is a debate that is going on in the press. There are various clubs that are clearly paying their footballers under the table. It's called profesionalismo marrón, Colombia kind of brown professionalism. And again, so eventually you kind of get the opinion, you get the idea that it is going to become officialized, and it just needs someone to push with sufficient strength for a professional league to finally develop and follow the example of some of the other southern countries where it's already been a fact of life for certainly at least 10 to 15 years.
By the end of the Second World War, then, what was the state of Colombian football domestically and internationally, its infrastructure, etc.? How did that compare to its more illustrious neighbours?
Yeah, I mean, it was still stuck in these regional leagues. So again, there is no national league. That will be formed in 1948 for the first time. But what you do have, I think, is some clubs that are gaining in regional support, in local awareness. They're starting to be identity creators of certain sectors of society, and are certainly starting to dominate in certain leagues. I'm thinking very much of Deportivo Municipal in Bogota, who by this time are now called Millonarios because of some of these famous names that they now have, or these kind of former Argentinians that have traveled to Colombia to play. So it is kind of like a secret that is open, that these Argentinian players are being paid. Santa Fe is another club that has very much established itself within Bogota. You have Junior in Barranquilla. You have Deportivo Cali in Cali as well. These are clubs that are now established. They have, they have directors. They have members. These are clubs that now have a following, but they are not playing each other. So there are questions saying, why are we not starting to try and form a national league? There are better connections by this time. We're now looking at the mid to late 1940s, and although there are still problems of connections between various cities, railways do not connect much of the Colombian cities. Plane travel is becoming more common. It's becoming slightly more affordable, and it is becoming doable. So there is connection between cities, and it's really a matter of time behind football making use of these connections and trying to create a national league to emulate the likes of Uruguay, of Peru, of Argentina, and the rest of the continent, really.
In closing, by the end of World War II, was it self-evident that the conditions were ready for the so-called El Dorado era?
Yeah, I think so. I think that you have ways of connecting significant cities. There is money in the country. There is enough trade and successful businesses to support it. You have growing urban areas with support, where the fan bases and support can come from. You have an acceptance that football is an important sporting activity. I think you have a general awareness that it is an important global activity as well, and one that is modern, and one that is something that Colombia should be participating in, given the successes of Brazil, of Uruguay and Argentina on a global and continental level. There is maybe an increasing understanding of the game. I think that it is being increasingly reported in the newspapers, which, if we go back to the 1930s, you do not have any sporting press. You really only have occasional sporting news of a match or some kind of other event. But by the 1940s, you start having publications like Estadio, which is a newspaper that is reporting not just on the football that's being played, but things like basketball, things like golf, things like women's tennis, things like athletics as well, so on and so forth. So all the kind of important conditions are there. You have media interest, you have political interest, you have enough money, you have potential fan bases, you have an awareness that Colombia is behind. You have, I suppose, money that is being paid already to certain players in order to improve the game. You have some coaches. It's part of an educational system that is slowly developing, and so more young people in the country are playing it. So I think all these things really contribute to why, in 1948, as we'll go on to in the next episode, the professional league is ready to be founded in Colombia.
With that, we'd like to thank you for your participation in this interview. Like you said, we'll discuss the following phase in a future podcast. So thank you once again. As always, for everyone listening, feel free to leave questions and comments. Mine and Paul's contact info is listed on the blog and podcast listing, as well as Mr. Watson's contact info as well, his Twitter link to his book, and other relevant links to Mr. Watson. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify and now on Google, Apple, Podvine, and Stitcher, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk podcast. So thank you again, and looking forward to the next time we discuss Colombian football history.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting.